So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my perspectives. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really pleased to have been asked to discuss this topic because I think it's really important, as Laura said. The title of my talk is Language Matters: How the Words Researchers Use in Autism Research Can Impact Autistic People. So I've organized my talk by first providing a definition of ableism and then describing some examples of ableist language in autism research, both historically and currently. I then discuss several ways that ableist discourses can have real impacts on autistic people's lives. I'll then close with a brief set of questions that autism researchers can use to decide if they need to make changes in the ways they communicate about autistic people. Before I start, I want to emphasize that I come to this topic from a place of humility and wanting to learn. I think it's important to acknowledge that my own scholarship prior to really engaging with this issue does not hold up to scrutiny in terms of the language I have used. Ableism and the language practices that reflect ableism was not something I was taught as a graduate student, and I only came to understand the importance of the way that I discussed autism after reading and listening to autistic people. I also come to this talk from my background in sociolinguistic traditions of language, which is concerned with the everyday practice of using language as opposed to language as an abstract entity. So I use a definition of ableism written by T.L. Lewis, who is a disabled educator and lawyer. TL describes autism or ableism as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. TL emphasizes that under this system, you don't even need to be disabled to experience ableism. You only need to be perceived as being disabled. Some of the ways that ableism may manifest for autistic people is in outcomes like underemployment, mental health disparities, victimization, and even suicidality. So many of you have probably heard the phrase actions speak louder than words, but language philosophers and researchers like J.L. Austin, Judith Butler, and Manny Shegloff have shown that language is performative. We do things with the words that we use. We do things like make an argument, give a lecture, profess our love to someone, or perform a marriage ceremony. These things are actions unto themselves and also build the social fabric of our lives. Sociolinguists like John Blumart and Norman Fairclough have shown how language choices both convey and perpetuate ideologies, which can be taken for granted lenses through which we view the world and are not always apparent to us. And so for autism researchers, this means that the discourses we use to communicate about autism are going to express some underlying ideology, even if we aren't fully aware of what that ideology is. There are lots of examples of ableist language in autism research, and I have quotes from two prominent early autism researchers here to illustrate this point. The first is from Leo Connor's seminal paper on the topic, published in 1943. In describing echolalia, he says, language, which the children did not use for the purpose of communication, was deflected in a considerable measure to a self-sufficient, semantically and conversationally valueless or grossly distorted measurement exercise. We now know that echolalia is actually an important communicative resource for autistic children and adults, but that reinterpretation didn't start to appear in the literature until around the 1980s. This, of course, led to several decades of interventions that aimed to stop autistic people from using echolalia. Connor interpreted his observations based on his underlying assumptions and wrongly concluded that autistic people who use echolalia don't have anything to say. The next two examples are from an interview with Ivar Lovaas, published in Psychology Today in 1974. He says, autistic children are severely disturbed. People seem to be no more than objects to them. They show no signs of warmth toward others. They do not appear to enjoy being held. They don't play with other children. We now know that this interpretation, like Connor's, was based on inaccurate assumptions about autistic children's behavior. A second quote was in regards to his view on the role of intervention. He says, you see, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense. They have hair, a nose, and a mouth, but they are not people in a psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing a person. You have the raw materials, but you have to build the person. You can see here pretty directly that Lovaas's ideology about autistic people questions their humanity, which only the interventionist can restore. Some people assume that this kind of language is a thing of the past for autism researchers, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this is not the case. I have 3 examples of studies published in the last 5 years, the first of which compares autism prevalence to a natural disaster that causes mass death and frames autism as an economic burden that could bankrupt entire countries. The second construes autism as a disease, a word choice that carries an exclusively negative connotation and evokes concerns around contagion and deterioration. The third paper uses language promoting a cure for autism, which the authors hope can be found in animal analogs that might uncover genetic causes. All 3 of these papers use deficit discourses to suggest that fewer autistic people would be better for society. There are 2 ways of understanding disability that are useful for thinking about different discourses around autism and the ideologies that underlie these discourses. On the one hand is the medical model, which construes disability as a feature of the individual, which can be treated by professionals to restore them to normative functioning. On the other hand is the social model of disability, which separates out impairments and disabilities. Impairments are individual attributes that limit the performance of functions that are valued by society. Disability occurs in instances where societies do not accommodate or support people with impairments. So disabilities are not something that exists within the individual. Impairments that are met with societal barriers result in disability. From this point forward, nearly all of the papers that I reference are by an autistic first author or co-author. This one is by autistic researcher Jack Den Houding, which provides an explanation of the neurodiversity paradigm in the context of autism research. The neurodiversity paradigm, which has elements of both the medical model and the social model, but draws much more strongly from the social model, considers autism to be a natural form of human variation. It also makes the claim that autistic people need support, not prevention or a cure. Most diversity proponents do view autism as a disability, contrary to some claims that they view autism as only a difference. However, the influence of the social model of disability suggests that impairments associated with autism are disabling when they occur in contexts that do not support, accommodate, or value people with impairments. Finally, the neurodiversity paradigm stresses that not all autistic traits that differ from non-autistic people are inherently impairments. Many are actually just neutral or even beneficial aspects of autism. There are many examples of autistic scholarship on the topic of ableist language, dating back at least to the 1990s, but probably earlier, that we can draw from for guidance. Some more recent examples are autistic lawyer and advocate Lydia Brown's essay outlining their preference for identity-first language. Steven Kapp, who is joining us today, and his colleagues' empirical study examines conceptualizations about autism and how it correlates with knowledge of the neurodiversity paradigm. Morénike Giwa has several excellent essays outlining the importance of identity-first language, and a very recent article describing their experiences being an autism researcher inundated with ableist descriptions of autism in a large portion of the autism research currently produced. Take just a second to talk about what is probably the most well-known topic in discussions of ableist language, which is how to refer to autistic people, whether to use person-first language as in child with autism, or identity-first language as in autistic child. Lorcan Kenny and his colleagues showed that many autistic people prefer identity-first language, even though many professionals, including researchers, prefer person-first language. On their blog, Autistic Hoya, Lydia Brown gives their rationale for this preference, saying, "It is impossible to affirm the value and worth of an autistic person without recognizing his or her identity as an autistic person. Referring to me as a person with autism or an individual with ASD demeans who I am because it denies who I am." They go on to stress that autism is not incompatible with personhood, making person-first language unnecessary and contradictory. Now I want to move to discussing the different ways that ableist discourses can impact the lives of autistic people, which is why this topic is so important for autism researchers to really engage with. First, ableist language can increase stigma. When autistic differences are reflexively framed as deficits inherent to the autistic person and the social context in which those differences occur are ignored, this can stigmatize autistic people. Autistic sociologist Damien Milton wrote a very influential essay on what he calls the double empathy problem, which points out that researchers are fixated on the difficulty autistic people have in understanding non-autistic people with very little reflection on the difficulty that non-autistic people have on understanding autistic people. Because of this, social deficits are thought to solely lie within autistic people, even though mutual understanding involves at least two people. Autistic scholar Melanie Yurgo points out that following evidence that autistic people were less likely to succeed in a false belief task than non-autistic people, theory of mind was then construed as a fundamental aspect of our humanity, which of course positions autistic people as not being fully human. This was an interpretation of evidence which extrapolated far from the data. More recent research suggests that scores on theory of mind tasks bear only a small correlation to social functioning in both autistic and non-autistic people. Ableist discourses can also influence our funding priorities. This chart from the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee shows that the largest chunks of autism funding go to researching biology and risk factors, some of which is geared toward preventing autism, while much smaller pots of money go toward researching services that might more directly impact the quality of life of autistic people who are already here. There can also be impacts on what we aim for the interventions we research to achieve. Many interventions have a pretty explicit goal of making autistic people appear less autistic or passing as a non-autistic person. Recent research refers to this phenomenon as masking or camouflaging, and there is at least some evidence that it increases anxiety and stress for autistic people and overall makes social interactions less rather than more enjoyable. Some interventions also aim to prevent or cure autism with the larger goal of reducing the number of autistic people. Jackson Howding makes the case in a recent essay with her colleagues that ableist discourses can also place the onus of change on autistic people, rather than pushing for systems level change that would reduce stigma and discrimination. This appears in discourses that assume poor outcomes autistic people face throughout life are solely due to their own deficits, rather than to living in an ableist society. I have a quote here from a recent essay attempting to defend criticisms raised by autistic people about Lovas's methods. The author says, during the time period of the Young Autism Project, which was run by Lovas, children were literally dying or experiencing 24-hour restraint to keep them from harming themselves, and many were destined to spend their entire lives in an institution. You can see here in the author's word choices, such as destined, that institutionalization is assumed to be a natural result of autistic people's impairments, rather than a result of living in a society with systems devoted to institutionalization. Relatedly, ableist discourses can construe autism as something that is inherently so undesirable that autistic people are perceived as unharmable. Recent research that I have conducted in collaboration with my doctoral student Shannon Crowley, Michael Sandbank at UT Austin, and Tiffany Wojnarowski at Vanderbilt has shown that early intervention researchers very rarely monitor or report adverse events that may occur during intervention trials. In a follow-up commentary to this work, autistic researcher Michelle Dawson and Sue Fletcher-Watson note that there are many features of autism interventions that have the potential to cause harm, stating, one example is the use of junk food reinforcers and related practices requiring junk food consumption, for example, preference assessments. Another is the targeting of anything autistics show, like distress, pain, fear, sadness, excitement, amusement, concentration, perseverance, curiosity, resourcefulness, etc., as non-compliant, problem, or challenging behavior. Another is the punishment, as in response blocking, response cost, etc., of autistics for being autistic, for flapping their hands, discussing their interests, etc. You can see in this quote that potentially harmful procedures are conveyed using technical terms like preference assessment, response blocking, and response cost that masks their potential for harm. The upshot of all of this is that how we frame autism in our work has real important consequences for autistic people. It can increase stigma, shift funding priorities in particular directions that may leave us without an appropriate evidence base to build useful support services for autistic people, lead us to pursue intervention goals that may inadvertently result in poor mental health outcomes, allow us to ignore needed systems changes that increase marginalization, and enable researchers to omit considerations of potential adverse events that could occur in the interventions we research. We should all be aware of the long history of ableism and autism research that is still present in the ways we communicate about autism today. But there are now numerous resources produced by autistic people on this topic to help us do better. rejecting ableist frameworks is that it might improve our ability to interpret our research findings. There are numerous examples of research conclusions that are based on deficit ways of thinking about autism that have turned out not to be helpful, such as that autistic people lack empathy, or that echolalia is not communicative, or that functioning level can be easily ascribed to an autistic person based on their cognitive skills. It's important to remember that nothing we do as scientists is neutral. There is always an underlying ideology that we use to make sense of what we perceive in the world. Thinking about our language practices, that is important to remember is that this isn't really just about the words we use. The way we communicate about autism is intertwined with what we choose to study, the research questions we pose, how we interpret our data, and ideologies that underlie all of these activities. Exchanging ableist words for non-ableist words isn't going to be enough if ableist agendas and ideologies remain. However, examining our language choices can allow us to see underlying ideologies that we may not have even been aware of. It's a starting point for those of us who are interested in changing the way we communicate about autism to reflect an anti-ableist stance. There are several questions we can pose. For example, we can ask, does my language suggest that autistic people are inherently inferior to or less human than non-autistic people? Does my language suggest that autism is something to be fixed, cured, controlled, or avoided? Does my language suggest that the goal of my research is behavioral control and normalization rather than promoting agency? Does my language unnecessarily medicalize autism when describing supports? And lastly, am I using particular words or phrases solely because it is a tradition in my field, even though autistic people have expressed that such language can be stigmatizing? So this concludes my portion of this panel. I hope that this is a useful starting point for sparking some discussion. For those interested, here are some key references that were discussed during my talk, and I'll make sure that I send along a copy of these slides just in case you want to look at any of these. Before I close, I want to thank my colleagues who worked with me on the paper that covered many of these topics, including Steven Kapp, Jessica Lester, Noah Sasson, and Brittany Hand. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. I think before the panel starts, I can answer one or two clarifying questions if anybody has questions directed specifically at this part.
So I think you discussed these issues about how you define when you talk about individual with autism. And I am not a clinician, but I work with many of the clinicians, and there is a different language use, whether you say an individual with autism or autistic people. And so some people use it, and you mentioned that there is not very good agreement on that. And so I think that we should agree on what would be the language to use, because I understand on both sides. So are you define the person as a person, or the person not as is, but because it has autism? So can you kind of comment and clarify what would be the best way to address somebody? Because some of the people that I talk to feel that individuals that have autism might get offended if you say autistic individual, because you are addressing them because they have autism and not because they're a person.
So in my capacity as a teacher educator, I always have at least one or two autistic students in my class. So I usually just ask them, do you have a preference? And they often do. And so I just, in my interpersonal interactions, I just ask their preference, which I think is a perfectly respectful, way to go about it. So I think there's when you're actually addressing people in your work that you're speaking with, you can ask their preference and then just use that preference. And then there's another question of our publications and the way that we communicate when we're referring to autistic people as a whole. So I think for the second one, if you're talking about like a research publication where you're not actually addressing someone in person, I think there are a couple of things you consider. One is, what is the general preference, even if there isn't complete consensus? And two, what is your rationale for choosing whatever language choice? And I think there's so much rich discussion about autistic people's preference for identity first language that for me, I find that rationale very convincing. So that's what I use in my work.
Thank you, Kristen, for that wonderful overview. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the paper that she has referred to, I will put a link to that paper in the chat. But it was a really influential commentary that was published in Adults with Autism, Autism in Adulthood. last year, and it's really changed how I think and perceive autism. So next, I have the honor of introducing a wonderful panel that we have, and I'm hoping that we can have a richer discussion delving more into the topics that Kristen has introduced with us. And so we have a panel of 4 wonderful autistic researchers and advocates that I will briefly introduce, and then we will get started with a discussion. So we have Patrick Dwyer, who is a PhD candidate in the UC Davis Department of Psychology. Patrick is an autistic graduate student in the Neurocognitive Development Lab who researches various topics, but primarily autistic sensory processing and attention. He's the co-chair of the INSAR Autistic Researchers Committee, and he also facilitates a community for neurodivergent students at UC Davis. We also have Kiki Godfrey, who is a LEND alumna and faculty, graduate student, disability advocate, public speaker, writer, researcher, and mother. She provides firsthand experience navigating the world both as an autistic adult and as the parent of 2 autistic children. She's participated in multiple symposia and panels related to neurodiversity and co-authored an article focused on unmet patient and family needs in autism. We also have Morénike Giwa Onaiwu, who's an educator, writer, public speaker, parent, and global advocate. Morénike is an autism self-advocate and parent of several children, including an autistic son and daughter. They are a college professor by day and mom, writer, activist all the time. They've previously served on the board of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, as well as other organizations. They are a humanities scholar at Rice University and co-chair of the NIH-funded Women's HIV Research Collaborative. They also serve on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. And we also have Steven Kapp, who is a lecturer, Faculty of Science and Health in the Department of Psychology at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. He's an autism researcher and advocate. Steven's studies examine how conceptions of autism, neurodiversity, and support associate with identity, lived experiences, and quality of life. He edited the first book to offer a history of the neurodiversity movement from activists in it, and influenced autism's diagnostic revision in the DSM-5. So we have this wonderful panel here. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bottema-Beutel, who will lead a discussion with our panelists, focusing on questions that they felt are important to address. So we have 5 questions that I'm going to put up on these slides that we'll discuss, the panel will discuss, and then afterwards, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Kristen is going to be leading the discussion, but I'll also be monitoring the chat in case there's anything that comes up there that, that I will bring up.
So our first question is, what about people on the autism spectrum who themselves seem to prefer more traditional or medicalized terminology? And I wanted to address this first question to Kiki.
I think that basically what it comes down to is, the individual's preference. I think that for some people, they either may not know that there's a difference or haven't explored that there's a difference, and they may be following, a clinician's base language, or they might be following, their parents' language or somebody else's language. But I think really what it comes down to is just respecting, what an individual prefers for themselves. I mean, I myself prefer identity first language using autistic person or autistic individual, but I conducted a research study for my LEND program, my end of the year research project, and it was based on terminology and iconography related to autism. I looked at 3 different groups, clinicians, parents, and autistic people, and that study found that the clinicians and the parents preferred person first language over individual first language, whereas the autistic people preferred individual first language, though there were some autistic people who, differed from that. So, I mean, there's definitely going to be a range of opinions on it, a range of knowledges on the subject, and honestly, it just comes down to what the person prefers.
I wonder if, as a follow-up question, if any of our panelists want to weigh in on why there might be a difference in preference between parents on the one hand and autistic people on the other hand?
Thank you for asking that question. I think that there's a variety of reasons. Some of it could be generational, because, parents may be, when people first language originated, it was really, really radical. It had its purpose. It was, people were accustomed to referring, the idea that a disabled person was really radical. So some of it might just be a vestige of the way that people were raised. But I think more often than not, it's actually due to whether they're cognizant of it or not, stigma. Because, when you list, there are various different reasons, but a lot of people will say, well, my son may have autism, but autism does not have him, or he's John, autism doesn't define him. Well, no one characteristic of anyone defines us. We have multiple characteristics as people, all people. But the fact that there's such an effort made to distance oneself from this, is seen is something that you see with, conditions that might be, life-threatening or, or terminal or what have you. And so I think that it's easier to think, well, this is still my child, just with this thing, that they've got, as opposed to the person who, if that's the neurology that you have, that's all that's the way the world works. That's the way things sound and move. And therefore it isn't, I was not, my birth certificate says Negro, and my school records for elementary school say Black, and then high school says Afro-American, and from the rest of my life, it's been African-American. I don't know what it might be, in the future years, but society evolves. But ultimately, none of those said baby with Blackness, baby with African-Americanness, baby with Negro-ness, and no one says I'm a person who teaches. We say I'm a teacher. I'm a person who performs medicine. No, I'm a doctor. So I think that, if an identity is not seen as a negative thing, then people don't mind incorporating that identity. It's that separation is really for a person's psyche because of the fact that autism has been seen as this negative force as opposed to a neutral, naturally occurring part of society.
I think autistic people are more likely to see autism as a natural, maybe inseparable part of the self, for better or for worse. And actually, the main founder of the neurodiversity movement, Jim Sinclair, has an essay, Why I Dislike Person First Language, which was published in 1999, and you can see it republished here in the chat. And one of the reasons is, autism may affect the way someone thinks and feels. But the same study that was the first to empirically look at autistic and non-autistic people's language preferences, which Kristen mentioned, autistic people also were more likely than non-autistic people to see autism as essentially biological, as caused by biology alone. And that wasn't related to whether people were aware of the neurodiversity movement, whereas being aware of the neurodiversity movement for autistic and non-autistic people alike moved people towards seeing autism as a positive identity that didn't need a cure. So it actually did affect, autistic people were more likely to prefer, identity first language regardless of neurodiversity awareness, but both autistic and non-autistic people were more likely to prefer autistic person to person with autism once aware. And again, so if being aware of the movement isn't even influencing, seeing autism as natural, and I think, a lot of people would think of it as, pervasive. And just because it's, one aspect of a person, I'm left-handed, I'm Jewish, I'm so many different things, but that doesn't mean that's all I am.
So our second question is, how could we handle a situation where we are relatively junior in our academic ranks or far down the author list and the senior lead authors on a paper want to use medicalized or ableist terminology? Do you have any advice? And I'm going to let Patrick start with this one.
Well, it's certainly a tricky situation, and one that I've been in the past, and some of the papers that have resulted. I'm not particularly proud of, and kind of regret not doing more in retrospect. But I do think that because people like you, Kristen, are publishing these papers, I actually have with some other co-authors a much shorter commentary on this same topic that's forthcoming in pediatrics. These references are things that somebody could bring up. I also think there's a good argument to be made just pragmatically that from people's own self-interest, you should probably be paying more attention to these things, or else there can be backlash, because people in the autistic community do read scientific papers. And for example, you may have been following this backlash against the sort of preemptive autism intervention study in Australia in the last few weeks. The paper that came out had a very medicalized, deficit-oriented sort of framing, although interestingly, the intervention itself, some of it was more geared towards like promoting empathy for the infant's perspective, very much in line with the double empathy problem. But the paper was framed in a very medicalized, deficit-oriented way. People in the community did not like that at all, and they let the researchers know. So there's also a self-interested sort of argument that you could appeal to there, that it's in the researchers' own best interests to try and be respectful of the community. I also feel like sometimes we have a tendency to just assume that language that is used is the objective or right language. As you were saying, Kristen, all of the language reflects an ideology, but we tend to assume that whatever is the language that we're using is just the right language. I actually had one paper come back with a comment from the editor saying, stop engaging in political advocacy and just use the correct terminology. And she was the one engaging in political advocacy to a much greater extent than me. She was saying that her way it was the only right way, and that all other ways were wrong. And I think that that's a point that's often not brought into these conversations, and that can sometimes really make people think for a second and go, actually, you might have a point there. This use of the language in a particular way that I'm doing is kind of like a, rigid, repetitive and restricted behavior. Maybe it's not actually the objective or right way of doing things at all. So hopefully those are strategies or arguments that if brought up, in a gentle way, might have some influence.
I was just going to say, I really like Patrick's answer. And the only part that I would probably add is that these are really difficult situations where a person is kind of weighing, okay, this is my career, this is, advancement, but then there's also your own psyche, and your own, sense of self. And there was a situation with a publication where I wrote to the lead authors and kind of shared some concerns, and it actually was about terminology that was stigmatizing about it, but not related to autism. And I shared some links and some information with them about why, I would like, would be considerate to consider changing. And so they were receptive, and, they went in and they made changes. And then when other authors reviewed, they all changed it back. And so it was just very frustrating in that situation. But what I've decided, sometimes if you can provide people with, with a rationale, for, this, then they're willing to change, or you explain that you want, I know most people, even if it's something that's, yes, it's a peer-reviewed article, but usually there are ways that those things get to the larger, to the greater public through, lay abstracts, or through Twitter, or through being picked up by the media in some kind of way, and something that kind of lasts, stands will last the time frame and will not be antiquated, dated, or harmful to anyone. But often people are really, it's hard for them to want to see your point of view, and they think it's kind of ridiculous. And this is, medical term. And, you know, what I've decided to do personally, and that's just for me, is that I will, if there won't be changes, then I will pull out of the of the paper. But I know that everyone cannot do that. Those circumstances are not realistic for everyone. But you know, it's just my small way of saying that it's not acceptable, and hopefully it will be something that will resonate with someone. And there's resources that people can look at that kind of give some suggestions of alternative ways to phrase things so that people don't have to feel attacked or singled out.
Yeah, Patrick, did you want to just voice the comment you left in the chat?
Yeah, I forgot to mention in my first answer that, you know, if all of these rationales that you bring up, if they fail, and you know, you are a junior person and you need this publication for your career, and the senior people are just being resistant, in my opinion, that's on them, and not you. There is a power dynamic there, and the senior authors ultimately, I think, have the responsibility here. So sorry for leaving that out the first time.
Maybe more discourses like this will help persuade the senior researchers to change their minds.
Yeah, I think it also helps for them the researchers might not be aware of the empirical evidence of, you know, for example, most autistic people's preferences on identity first language. And if they're, for example, in psychology, it says, you know, call people what they want to be called, which also, of course, is true if you're talking with an individual who has a different preference, as Kristen said. And then there also are sometimes options for, so beyond educating someone, there are sometimes kind of compromise options that are a bit more neutral, such as on the autism spectrum is a language choice that there's a paper by Burry and also the one by Kenny that Kristen mentioned, that, you know, it's sort of overall across groups, at least as popular a choice, but it's not as, people aren't as passionate about it, but fewer people are vehemently against it too.
I just had in the chat that I agreed with Morénike that, you know, if there was a situation that I didn't feel comfortable with, the language they were using or the research or anything, I would definitely, you know, drop my name, you know, first voice my concerns. And if they weren't heard, I would definitely, you know, not want to be involved with the research. Luckily, I have never been put in that situation. I've worked with, you know, amazing people who, you know, were totally willing to listen and you know, make any changes that I suggested. So I'm just really, really lucky in that respect.
There's a comment in the chat from Lee Pachter. It's also the responsibility of peer reviewers and editors to bear some of the responsibility by reviewing and developing guidelines for publication that will assist researchers in becoming aware of these issues. I completely agree with that. You know, it has to be an effort from everybody involved.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I was just going to add that I think when very senior, well-known people not only use you know, a language choice that they think is more respectful, but also provide a rationale for it, it helps less senior people make the case. You know, there are examples out there. It isn't, you know, it's something that nothing terrible happened when we made this change. It's already there, and so it's not something that isn't available to us to do.
Morénike shared that there are some tools that might be worth sharing with others. An NIA language guide that addresses some aspects of respectful terminology and allergy and infectious disease research that might be a helpful resource. So Morénike, I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on your work in other fields in terminology, because I know you have, that's where this came from for you.
Yes, exactly. And so it's very interesting. And so prior to being involved in autism research, I've done a lot of work in gender and racial justice, as well as in you know, HIV treatment and prevention. And so there has been a movement for some time within the community, the HIV community, and within some of the clinical networks. And there's a researcher Dr. Vicky, oh goodness, I need to find her last name, but she's out of University of South Florida, has done a lot of really good work on, respectful terminology and literature and media. And so one thing that, stigmatizing language that hurts people. And so there had been some essentially telling people that when they're writing articles and they're saying, oh, well, this is about an HIV infected child. Oh, the number of infections. People don't think, there are so many things that are infections that are viruses, but we don't refer to them that way. People don't walk around saying they have flu infection and so on. With COVID, you hear more of that now, but prior to that, it's very rare that people don't use those terms for mono, for RSV and so on. And so there was a practice that some people did where we started to highlight every single time you saw the word infected or infection. And we did an exercise at an annual network meeting where most of the senior researchers were there, where we asked them to get their phone out and do a Google image search for the word infection and to look at the first few images that came up and to explain that this is what people are associating. There's no reason to say infected. You can say HIV positive. You can say person living with HIV. You can say acquired as opposed to, obtained, transmitted. And so, this, gained traction along with some of the efforts to get people to use more respectful terminology with regard to gender, because that was another area where people were being, stigmatized, where they were, being categorized as a gender that they didn't identify with and so forth. And so that has really helped. It's still a slow process because there are a number of people who either there are people who are accustomed to using a term, or there are even some people who within the community who are, attached to a term. There are some people who say, I consider myself a person with AIDS, not HIV. This is a part of my identity. I've survived. And so, we want to be respectful of individual preferences, as has been shared earlier, but the community at large, I think it's best to find terms that are either neutral, as Steven suggested, like on the autism spectrum or on the spectrum, or to use the preferred terminology of the community at large.
I think that's a really good point about looking across to other fields. And our field isn't the only one which is having to contend with this issue. I think there's lots of other places we can look to see how these discourses play out, what the history is, and how people move forward. To question 3, there's a lot of debate right now about terms like severe or profound autism. What is your perspective? Is there a way of respectfully referring to these populations so we are not being ableist, but also not ignoring or marginalizing their existence? Morénike, would you take this one?
Sure, and I know my colleagues have plenty of things to say too. This one always bothers me when people are like mild autism, severe, and I'm thinking people are not sauce, we are people. And so I feel like it really would be better for people to just explain what they mean. So some people use terms such as, high support needs or complex medical needs or minimal support needs, but some people feel that those are not, precise enough. And so what I would suggest is a person say, this is my neighbor, John. We're seeking some services for him because he is a minimally speaking or a non-speaking, person with intellectual disability. He engages in self-harm and, wandering, and, he has seizure activity or whatever, so that helps a person a lot more if you let them know exactly what it is that needs to be addressed or what have you, than to just say severe or profound. It's, if you think about the reason why we now have ASC as opposed to Asperger's and PDD and OS and autistic disorder, is because, I remember one person's quote, it's like cleaving meatloaf at the joints. It's, variable. And so what is severe or profound? There is a saying that, high functioning is a way, saying someone's high functioning is a way of ignoring their support needs, and saying someone is low functioning is a way of ignoring their strengths. And it also doesn't take into account the fact that people's needs and abilities can vary in different environments at different times of their lives and so forth. And so I think there's nothing wrong with acknowledging the difference between people, but using words like severe or low functioning, mental age of a 3-year-old, those things are very dehumanizing. And I don't think that any person would want to be called that, those types of names. In the Black community, we have terminology, for hair textures. And there used to be one, well, there still is, where people would say good hair and bad hair. And good hair was hair that was softer, finer, as opposed to hair that was more coarse or, thicker. And if you had bad hair, which was a hair that was type that was more common in the Black community, then you were less than. And that's what I think of when you think of low and high, or severe and mild. Aside from being inaccurate, it also just it doesn't empower people, and it doesn't tell us anything.
Functioning labels, they can be harmful, to a person's self-esteem, to, the greater disability community. And, just to echo that, I hear from other parents, there's good autism and bad autism, and, that there's no way that I could possibly understand what the bad autism is, because I've never experienced it. And these are people who, don't know me, don't know my children, don't know anything about me personally, who are saying, no, you've never experienced that, because they look at me and they see high functioning all the time, right? Because that's what I present to them, but they've never seen me, at my best, at my worst. They've never seen that, there may be times where, I struggled just as much as a so-called person with, low functioning, or, whatever term, bad autism, whatever term they want to use. And, co-occurring symptoms that come with autism. They may have never seen, that I possess any of those, or that my children possess any of those. So they're just really making assumptions, and based on what they see and what they hear. So I think it's just harmful all around that, using these functioning labels and not using language, like, oh, so-and-so has anxiety and depression, but they may have good days. So you may be seeing them on their good days, but you don't actually experience what it's like for them on their not so good days.
Looking at autism in childhood, how do we balance the neurodiversity standpoint with medicalizing autism, given the highly prevalent need for various therapies, for example, for language disorder or executive function?
One key concept is that the neurodiversity movement doesn't oppose intervention in general, and it actually does overlap with the medical model in some respects of recognizing challenges and the need for some support that may, if you want to call it intervention at times, but it depends on what is targeted, why, and how, well, executive functioning is an important thing. I think most people would agree on, like flexibility, and that was something the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, we were encouraging more emphasis on flexibility and the like for the, the accompanying text of the so-called severity scale that we tried to tie this back into the previous question. We tried to eliminate it altogether in the neurodevelopmental disorders work group that revised the autism diagnosis, and the DSM-5 wanted to eliminate it because people may do well because of support, and we wouldn't want that support taken away because, now they seem to be functioning well with it. And, and Ari made that, Naaman, the president at the time of the of ASAN, made that point to the work group, and that they really were convinced. And but of course it was imposed DSM-5 wide, so we were trying to say, okay, if you have to target an area within restrictive repetitive behaviors, it is important for people to be able to cope with change, which is an aspect of life, etc. So, for example, but and language, I mean, it is important for people to find a reliable means of communication. It might not be in a typical way. It might be through typing, or, it might not be mutually exclusive. There are various forms of augmentative and alternative communication, but it is very important and communication, of course, including language, works both ways.
Add something to Steven's answer, because Steven and I were recently working together with another great Kristen in this field, Kristen Gillespie-Lynch, and my PI Susan, on a study, and we wrote a bunch of statements about intervention goals, and then did a factor analysis. And there's one factor that's sort of normalization oriented intervention goals, like trying to make people less autistic, getting rid of repetitive behaviors, that sort of thing. And then there was another factor that was more like adaptive, useful skills. And I don't think we had an executive functioning item per se, but I'm sure it would have fallen into that factor if we had one. And we really did notice that there was a pretty significant gap there, that neurodiversity supporters and autistic adults, which are not synonymous categories, were very opposed to normalization, but much more open to the idea of interventions that are trying to teach adaptive skills. And that kind of, I think, gets into the next slide there on question number 4, if we can jump ahead, which is asking, is there some middle ground between like the medical and social models of disability? And there are certainly some, things like social relational or social ecological models of disability that are trying to say, like, okay, maybe society doesn't, maybe it is in fact the case that society is not responsible for all ills, but they're still trying to direct attention to the importance of reforming society whilst leaving the door open towards teaching adaptive skills. And based on the data that Steven and I collected, it did seem like there was a lot of openness to this sort of perspective in the neurodiversity movement, even if maybe a lot of people were identifying as supporters of the social model, and meaning by that, perhaps one of these, some people might call it like the weak social model, or the social relational model. So it's really complicated and nuanced, but I think there is a lot of middle ground and gray area, and being open to intervening to cure co-occurring medical conditions and so on. I think a lot of neurodiversity supporters are very pragmatic about these things, as long as you're not trying to suppress autistic traits or force people to mask or camouflage, or using coercive strategies designed to try and change who people are and that sort of thing.
I agree with Patrick, and actually that in Morénike about the interactionist model, I argued in a handbook I could put it here, published by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, that the neurodiversity movement or framework does take an interactionist perspective between the medical and social models, or some people would say a weak form of the social model. And to some extent, the social model is about trying to change society, and the medical model is about trying to change the individual. And sometimes those aren't entirely incompatible, but and in the Deficit, Difference, or Both paper, we called those false dichotomies because it was for a special issue on deficit, different, or difference, and we said that the neurodiversity movement, according to our data and conceptually, opposes elimination of autism, but there's some gray area and potential middle ground around amelioration that the new study with Patrick gets into further. And actually with celebrating autism and even reforming society in the new data, there's high agreement between autistic and non-autistic people and supporters and not about some of these issues. So so sometimes multiple approaches can be compatible.
I just wanted to read out Morénike's comment because I think it's it's important. So she says, one aspect of this that can be difficult to reconcile is that generally, in order to obtain services one might need, particularly in the case of youth, the deficits are emphasized in order to justify the need for said services. So you almost have to distill your child down to their weaknesses to acquire help, which is hurtful and dehumanizing. And she also said that once your youth makes progress, the services get taken away. And so I wonder if parents on the panel or anyone on the panel wants to comment on that more.
I think that definitely, has been an issue where, your child makes progress and then they no longer, meet the requirement or the needs for services, and it can be extremely frustrating. And then there's this model of, all children need the same supports. All autistic children need the same supports in terms of, there's only a specific number of things that medical insurance will cover, which ALTA and the regional centers in California are, working with people in the community to try to correct through the self-determination model, which is showing, just an increased improvement over services, whereas you can define, for your child what services you think would most benefit them through a creative and innovative, approach. As far as one of the changes were that instead of having a bed at a facility, if your child needed to go there at a medical facility, you could instead use that money to pay for camp for your child, a camp that they could go away, an outdoor camp. And whereas most parents wouldn't send their children to, a medical institution to have some time away from their child, they would consider sending them away to camp for 2 weeks where they could have some, great experiences and bond with others. So I think that, that's making strides. I know the IEC is also trying to address medical supports and services, and make sure that, everything that parents and children want will be covered, not just, your typical ABA, OT, speech therapy, feeding interventions, like the typical covered services, or like respite care, be more flexible with those services and make sure that they address the needs of the child versus just, what's been defined medically or what's covered medically. And I think that as we, interact with this new model and we expand it and educate providers. I mean, just basic provider education about autism. There's still a lot of providers out there who just don't know or understand autism, and just making sure that there's this comprehensive model. I mean, the IEC probably is one of the best. They have one of the best models I've seen so far as provider education and identifying providers that are compatible. Their model of revising care and payments, and it's something that we all need because we're all different individuals. We all have different needs, and we could benefit from a structure that allowed us to be the people we are and who we want to be, while still getting all of our services and our needs covered, and really looking at the individual as a whole, and getting help for those supports. So I think that we're taking steps toward where we need to be. I think we have a long way to go, but I'm very excited to embark on these new journeys as we've come out with the Self-Determination Act. We've just started that recently. So over the next year, I'm excited to work with, our social worker at ALTA to, explore all of the different options for my children that they've been missing out on before, the Self-Determination Act started. So
I think that's a really good example. The diagnosis and a listing of deficits as a gateway to services is a perfect example of systems change that we might need to reduce stigma, not just interventions focused on specific people and changing on specific people. I noticed there was some questions in the chat. Christine, did you want to read some of those questions before going on to the next one?
Well, so Marjorie had a question, but we have one last set question for the panel, and then Marjorie, I promise we'll get to your question if that's okay, and I will ask you to talk about that. Patrick, did you want to bring up anything here before we go on to the next question? Or
I already addressed it kind of, right?
Okay, so let's just go through the last question, and then Marjorie will get to your question, which is a good one.
Okay, so the last,
before we go to the last question, I'll try to be fast. I just want to say that, like in terms of the middle ground, it's kind of like, I think that sometimes I've read myself and I'm thinking, where did they get this definition of neurodiversity? Like they're saying, oh, these are people who think that it's not a disability, it's only a difference. You shouldn't do anything, just accept. I'm thinking, no, acceptance, yes, but no one says accept and not, find ways to improve one's life, find ways to understand how to deal with change or how to be able to communicate. What we're saying is not to change someone to something that they're not, but to build who they are. And so there's a number of things that are very disabling. It's like I think about anything else, like, if you think about gender, or if you think about, the geographic location one lives in, there's nothing in life is all pros. Neither is it all cons. Most things are a mix. And I think that's the problem, is that people think that neurodiversity means that you think that every single thing about autism is an advantage, and there's nothing about it that is just neutral or that might be troublesome. And that is very much not accurate. I think it's about acceptance and loving who you are with and in spite of your, strengths and weaknesses. And that's where I think people get confused. I could give them a whole list of all the things that are troublesome, but I could also give them a list of the things that are wonderful and amazing about it.
So I'll just read the last question. Who are the real autism experts? People on the autism spectrum, their relatives, scientists, others, or does it depend? Kiki, I was wondering if you could take this question.
I was just going to comment in the chat. I would say us, autistic adults. I mean, we've lived our life, as autistic people. I mean, you can't get more of an expert than, actually living your life being autistic. So I would say, not just any one person, but, a collaborative, a community of people who are adults and maybe even children. I definitely talk to my children all the time about autism. They're like my little soapboxes. I say autism and they can just, oh yeah, autism, blah, 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 blah. And they can just, they can go on and they get super chatty about it. And it's great that I have these little, kind of mini-me's who are already starting to advocate, on behalf of themselves and others, because they've, been around so many different children, with disabilities. And, they know that just because somebody has a disability, it doesn't mean that their perspective is any less than, anybody else's, and that they have their own unique voice and their own unique traits and, personalities. So I think that the community at large, for sure, people who are actually autistic are definitely, the experts. Though, through the Mind Institute, I've come across a great many of people who, are also willing to listen and who have very similar ideals and thoughts, and people who are compassionate, who, definitely want to help. And those people can definitely be experts in their fields as well. And the fact that they listen to autistic people, I think, makes it even more so.
May I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Steven.
So in terms of, well, lay or experiential expertise, which is the expertise through lived experience, you know, it would be autistic people, and Jackson Hooting, Damien Milton, others have written, you know, scholars about, you know, experiential expertise and autistic expertise. But in terms of scientific expertise, well, you know, autistic people can be scientists, but I mean, and we can question, you know, whether the relationship of academic and scientific expertise to, you know, true knowledge, but, you know, in some ways that's its own power issue. And, you know, so in terms of if you're conducting participatory research, for example, you know, if you're doing community-based participatory research, speaking as someone as part of Aspire, for example, I think if you're a PhD student in the autism field or an academic, you know, you might not really be a community partner in that sense. Even if you're autistic, you would be an inside researcher per se. You could be an academic partner, you know, in the Aspire Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership and Community, and what is it? Something in education. Brain isn't functioning, but there's but also in terms of kind of academic and scientific and clinical expertise, autistic people in a study that I'm a joint primary author of had the more knowledge of autism than non-autistic people in our sample, according to, you know, the Stone Autism Awareness Survey, which has been adapted according to the latest scientific understanding of autism over the years. And that paper is, again, open access in here. Thank you.
Thanks. Morénike, did you want to say something? You have your hand raised.
Yes, but first, if someone else wanted to go, I can wait.
I think we're going to have a comment, but I did want to leave some time for audience questions too. So please.
Okay, I was going to share that quickly, that I think that, so I think it's probably not a surprise to most people here that there have been some tensions and, you know, in, you know, the community in terms of, you know, non-autistic autism parents and autistic adults, and people, you know, basically saying who is the voice and who knows more. And, you know, kind of I really like what, you know, Steven was sharing about kind of like the, you know, kind of like, you know, merging different forms of knowledge to have a better, you know, stronger, you know, form of knowledge. Because I think about the fact that I think about parents, I don't know this person's child at all. I don't know your child's name. I don't know their favorite color. I don't know how they got that scar on their knee. I don't know what they like to eat. I don't know what it means when they, you know, do their shoulder like this. Mom may not share that child's neurology, or dad, or whomever, a parent, but they're with that child every day. They may not understand everything about their child, but there's expertise in that particular child's lived, you know, that they have to a point. I have been an autistic child, and I'm an autistic adult, and I'm raising autistic and non-autistic people. I have an understanding of, well, maybe this means this, or I know this felt this way to me, or this way to me. So I feel like combining these two areas, your specific knowledge of your child, and then my internal knowledge of possibly the experiences that they might be having, or the world that they're living in, or so forth, putting those together is really like, you know, kind of like, to me, it's beautiful. It's like when you take you know, the partnership between community and researchers, that lived expertise and that learned expertise together, you fill those gaps. So I feel like, you know, my obstetrician who delivered my 2 biological children is male. He's never been pregnant. He's a cisgender male, I'm sorry. He's never delivered, you know, given birth, but I entrusted him very much with my life, and he's amazing. He's gained an ability, you know, he's gained knowledge and expertise through study and through practice. And then there could be, you know, a lay person who's a community midwife, or, you know, or what have you, who has her own level of expertise. And so I think the word is big enough to spread it around, expert. I think we've got a lot of experts around, in terms of, I guess, real, technically, yes, the people with the lived expertise, but I don't think that denotes the fact that there's nothing to be gained from what others have to bring to the table too.
Those were the 5 questions that the panelists posed and wanted to cover. And we just have about 10 minutes left. Marjorie, did you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it out? And then we have another question about genetics that I wanted to cover as well.
The question that I wrote was about methods of, you kind of waded into the waters talking about minimally verbal people, so-called minimally verbal people with autism. And I've become aware that there's a lot of communication methods that are spoken about in literature and a lot of first-person accounts of adults, children who've learned through typing methods to communicate. And there's a lot of controversy around this. The methods are known as functional communication, rapid prompting method, and others. And people report really amazing results with these. However, there's a big problem that a lot of the people that are assisting in this functional communication may in fact be providing what the autistic adults are allegedly saying. And so the American Speech and Hearing Association has come out really strongly against all these methods as being very abusive. And there's been a lot of problems with the methods and people administering them, granted. Yet there's a steady drumbeat and a series of movies and these books that suggest that for some people, they really do help them communicate. And I've spoken with several parents who swear by them as well. And I was just curious what you all think about this, and how you would weigh in on whether this is a good thing, a bad thing, whether we need more research or what.
Well, if I can just,
sorry for not reading your blog, but that's what I was.
It's a long blog post to read, and my colleagues on the panel were saying lots of interesting things. You can look at it later. Okay. Yeah. So I'm obviously a speaking autistic person, but I do have some thoughts on this. I think it's really unfortunate that there is so much, really strong ideological positioning on this on both sides. Like on the one hand, you have people who are just sort of behaving as though these are methods that always work, when, as you say, Marjorie, there's certainly in the case of facilitated communication, some very clear evidence that communication has in the past been hijacked by facilitators in ways that are very harmful and denying the right to communicate. On the other hand, a lot of the skeptical stuff that's written about this is also, I think, far too strong. You hear people saying like, oh, because so-and-so used RPM or FC several years ago and now communicates independently, that nothing that this person says, even when they're communicating independently, can be listened to or trusted, which is absurd. There is plenty of anecdotal evidence of people who have used these techniques and gone on to develop from them independent communication, which that's not in dispute. It's independent and not facilitated. So I really think that there's a need for us to take a step back and really try and get a more individualized approach and try and confront some of these extremist positions on this. And really, I think in particular, we need to do more research to try and figure out how we can accurately figure out the level of language comprehension that somebody has in order to direct them towards appropriate AAC techniques for their particular needs, which is just something that we are terrible at right now. Like there's a bit of eye tracking work on this. Susan and I have been doing some work with an eye tracking task, but it's very crude and not at all like clinic community ready. A bit of EEG work, but I think that's even more even more unready. So yeah, a lot of issues here. The last thing I will say on this is just to plug our Neurodiversity Summit, which is coming up Friday, November 5th, and Vikram Gaswal, who has done work on this topic, will be speaking. So I would definitely recommend that.
Right, Vikram Jaswal has written probably the most, I mean, a lot of the old papers are all about reviews of each other. And yes, of course, there were some problems there, but Vikram Jaswal has at least taken a step towards trying to do something that's more experimental, I think.
I just added a link to the register for the summit in the chat.
They didn't pay me to set this up.
In the interest of time, because we only have a few minutes left on the panel, I did want to get to one other question that was posed to the panel in the chat. And I wish we had more time. We extended this, but it's clearly not enough time. But this person was wondering the panel's thoughts on genetic testing and using gene names for referring to diagnosis, for example, FOXG1 associated with NDD and so on. We can tackle genetic testing first.
So, I mean, at a certain level, it's reality, and we have to, in the neurodiversity movement, embrace reality that there are these genetic variants that exist. And I do think, though, that there's a hugely complicated ethical questions around here when it comes to genetic testing, especially when you're getting into prenatal genetic testing. Like, what is this being used for? Like, ideally, we would want this information to be used to promote community and to try and bring people together. But, is it instead being used in a eugenics-oriented way? And that, of course, raises some really complicated questions about, like, the individual interests of parents who want to live their own lives, and our society doesn't provide enough respite supports and caregiving supports, so that could really be impacted by having a child with a disability. On the other hand, the collective rights of people with disabilities to exist, it's a complete mess, and I can't give an answer to this in just a few minutes. I'll just briefly, say it's really complicated.
I'm in favor of genetic testing to, identify genes and possibly as, a futuristic way to, identify autism and many other, co-occurring symptoms, other diseases, illnesses. I think that genetics and genomics are, the way of the future. I mean, I am not in support, like as Patrick mentioned, of eugenics and, eliminating, autism or, other neurodiverse attributes such as, ADHD and, Tourette's. There's a whole group of neurodiverse conditions. But I think that identifying autism through genetics would make it a more streamlined process. It could also allow for, targeted therapies and medications for, not even autistic people, but just people in general. While I was in the LEN program, I did a genetics rotation, and I learned just an incredible amount of information about, how genetics and genomics affects us, and, sat in on different, differentials, and, drawing out a pedigree and tracing, autism through, families. And as most of us know, autism is, very highly genetic. So I think that, involving a genetic aspect is just, it's necessary. And I think that, I think that hopefully, 10, 20, 50 years from now, we'll be in a better position to have more of our questions answered.
Thanks so much, Kiki. I know that we're at the end of our time, but I think there's a really important question in the chat. And Morénike, I wonder if you could just briefly tackle that. And people who need to leave, feel free to leave. But if the panel wants to stay for a moment to address this question regarding basically hiding a child's diagnosis from them, please comment.
And there's there's also an article that was posted that I think that would be really helpful to take a look at as well in the chat. But I was just going to quickly say that, it's important, you want to respect parents, but we also want to think about best practices. So I think about myself as an adoptive parent. And in previous generations, what people did was lie to children until they were 18. They had fake pictures, where people, or they would tell them they looked like some, distant relative. And it was felt like them not knowing was protecting them. And we found that that's very harmful. There's just, a lot of things where, there's so much research about other conditions and even in autism as well, about how it improves, a child's psyche and ability to communicate their needs and understanding if they have some language to be able to articulate what's happening. And so I really think that it needs to be done gently, but parents, providing them with some resources about how this could help the child, and that it's not there, that the parent might be making it, more frightening than it really is, and help guiding them hopefully into being able to work together and disclose that it can be very empowering.
Great, thanks. Any other panelists want to chime in very quickly on this? And then Flora, I know.
Sure, I had a quick comment about it. During the parenting group at the Mind for Social Skills, I was first exposed to the topic of disclosure. It wasn't something, that really had come up before, especially for us in our family. Everybody is neurodiverse in our family. And I was just blown away that there were people who had teenage children, who had still not disclosed autism. And I was very troubled by it, and also confused that, they were at the Mind Institute, they were attending a social skills group, but yet they still hadn't been disclosed to them that they were autistic. And I actually ended up, it was a required group. I ended up sending my husband to attend just because that one topic just brought up, it was just so triggering, and it was so just mind-boggling for me. I decided, I should probably stay at home rather than, taking up this entire group to just stand on my soapbox and say, how are you not telling your children? Like, I was like, I think I'm going to stay at home for this. I did, email, a few people about it, but it was just a very hard topic for me to, wrap my mind around, as a parent, as an autistic parent of autistic children. I could definitely hear where the parents were coming from, but at the same time, my kids were very involved in their not only diagnosis but the diagnostic process. And when we did get their diagnosis, it wasn't, a bad thing. It was, congratulations, you're autistic, welcome to, the world, it was a good thing. We never framed it as, oh, well, this is this, we never made it like, well, you may have this, we never played it as a bad thing. It was always, well, we're coming here to, do some tests, and it's going to be fun, and everybody's going to be nice. And it was just a very positive thing, and it was congratulations, and let's talk about this, and let's learn about this. And every year I still I volunteer. I've been numerous times to my kids' schools to do a presentation on autism. I read the kids a book about autism. I talk to them about what I feel are the common misconceptions and questions that kids have had in the past about autism. And then I leave a very large amount of time for the kids to ask questions about autism. And they have just some of the best questions ever. I've done it with second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth graders. I didn't go this year because of or last year I didn't go because of COVID, and this year also because of COVID. But you know, it was just so great, you know, every year to see the kids just so interested with questions. And we might actually invite parents as well to participate so that they can learn as well. That was something that was mentioned last year, that we should start inviting the parents to attend it as well so that they can learn alongside their kids.